allowed. Okay. And now where's share screen? There it is. All right. Oh my goodness. Technology. Slideshow from the beginning. Whoop. Go back. Okay. If I were giving this talk in any institution in Australia, I would, and all speakers would first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. That's something that I think also happens in Canada. So in solidarity with Indigenous people, I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land in Pasadena, California, which are the Hahamonga Tongva, and thank them for allowing us to be settlers on their traditional land. First of all, I want to say I am not an expert in Aboriginal art, but I taught for 15 years art history, including Australian art history at the Australian National University in Canberra. And at that time, my husband worked at the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. And this was at a time when all of the issues of native title and really the beginnings of Aboriginal art, as we understand it as a contemporary movement, were really starting to coalesce. So we were quite involved in all of that and in the native title claims. At the same time, we were commissioned to write a cultural tour guide to Australia, and that's this, the blue guide. I can't see myself on this anymore. And that took us all over the place, and we did a lot of traveling and learned a lot about not only Australian culture, but Aboriginal culture as part of Australian culture. And so at this time, this is when what we call Aboriginal art now as a contemporary movement really became, as the late great Australian art critic Robert Hughes has called it, the last great modern art movement. So today I'm going to talk about the development from traditional elements to contemporary Aboriginal art, and talk about all of the intriguing and complex questions that these works raise when confronting a modern Western society. First of all, the question of ethnography versus art versus fine art. What is initially considered ethnography and how does it become fine art? What are the implications of the art market in the Western world for tribal and indigenous people and tribal and indigenous production of objects and items which may have very different meanings for them. And finally, one of the things that as an art historian I found the most fascinating to deal with at the time and still am dealing with are, what do we make of our aesthetic response to these images as non-Indigenous people, and to images that for the maker have very, very different meanings. Oh, okay, George is telling me that somebody's waiting. Just a minute, let me, there we go. Okay. Okay. There they are. All right, let me go back. Oh, wait. Okay, let's hope that everybody's there now. What are we supposed to do with the fact that we have a particular aesthetic response to these images, which are legitimate responses, but have nothing to do with how the creators have made them? And also that brings up the question of using these images, which are in many ways sacred, as decorative elements. So this is, I just put this up as a picture of contemporary Aboriginals dressed for or decorated for a ceremony, a symbol. And since so many of you don't know really about Australia, I thought I would start with a map to give some idea of what we're talking about, and to give an idea again of the enormous expanses of space that we're talking about. These are nomadic people originally, initially. So what we're talking about are this is the East Coast, which is where most of the population is. As most of you know, 85 to 90% of Australians live along the coastline. The entire center, what we call the outback, is entirely desert. When I was teaching Australian art, and especially expeditionary art, all of the expeditions would start with the term the ill-fated expedition, because they were always looking for a river in the middle of the country, and there isn't. This is all desert. Now up here, this is the top end, what we call this is where it's monsoonal during the wet season, and then the dry season. Those are the two seasons. Darwin is the one city in the one town in the Northern Territory. Here's Alice Springs, and Uluru, the famous rock, Ayers Rock, is about there. A lot of the tribal art that we're going to be talking about is going to be in this area. And this is all really remote desert. Does somebody have their sound on? I can hear a phone ringing. Okay. Up here, this is Cape York. This is Arnhem Land. Arnhem Land is a Aboriginal reserve. So they weren't put on reservations, but there is land that is entirely Aboriginal, run by Aboriginal tribal law and tribal groups. So this just gives you an idea. Here's Tasmania, which is often forgotten and left off of maps, which is way down here as a separate island. I also wanted to mention, because I've said that the Institute was the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Institute. So this is a map of the Torres Strait, which you see is up here above Cape York. The Torres Strait Islands there are about 38 of them which are inhabited. They are distinct genetic group from Aborigines. They're more related to Melanesian and Solomon Islanders. Many of these islands will have very small populations and will have at least 3 or 4 different languages, distinct language groups. The Aborigines have been in Australia for at least 40,000, but probably up to 60,000 years. They are the descendants of the first people to leave Africa up to 75,000 years ago. That has been substantiated by a genetic study, confirming that they may be the oldest continuous culture on the planet. They always consisted of small nomadic groups, each with their own language. And here I show a map of the Aboriginal language groups. In the 18th century, there were between 350 and 750 distinct Aboriginal social groupings, each with their own language and dialects. At the start of the 21st century, there are fewer than 150 Indigenous languages still in daily use, and all except about 20 are highly endangered. So there are only about 10% now that the children are being taught the language. And those are usually in the most isolated places. To get an idea here, we are out here in the desert. These are the Walpiri people. We'll be talking about some of the artists involved with the Walpiri. Arente is another large group, but remember, these are all separate and distinct languages. They may be in some ways linguistically connected, but they're all very different for these small groups. Aborigines really traditionally had no settlements, very little material culture. So they consist of what used to be called a hard primitivism, as opposed to a soft primitivism of the Polynesians, for example. So this just gives us an idea of what we're talking about. And remember, this entire area here is very, very dry, very, very remote, and very isolated. For example, the Northern Territory is the size of Great Britain or bigger, I think, and it has 2 highways. So that gives you some idea of the distance. And this expanse across is the size of the United States. So it's big. I want to, before we start looking at the art, I think it's important to place in context what was happening in terms of Aborigines in the middle of the 20th century, and the importance of what comes to be known as the native title movement. This is the late great Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, who in the 1970s, the early 1970s, a group of Aborigines who were working as stockmen in Queensland, living only paid in food and not having any access to their traditional land, began a strike. And the strike was mostly about gaining access to the fact that they owned the land. Now, the problem with this is that when the white settlers arrived in 1788 in Australia, they declared the land as terra nullius, which means it belonged to no one. Because these were nomadic people who had no settlements, the colonists, the English settlers, declared that legally the land was terra nullius, did not belong to anyone, which was a nice, convenient way to be able to come in and just occupy the land. This was a historic moment in 1975. This is a very famous picture of Gough Whitlam symbolically pouring sand into Vincent Linyare's hands to say that they were now the traditional owners of this land. The other major figure in this this battle was Eddie Mabo. He was from the Torres Strait Islands, so a Torres Strait Islander who also campaigned for Indigenous land rights, and this led to a landmark decision at the High Court of Australia in 1992 to declare that the legal doctrine of terra nullius had been overturned. And this is Mabo standing in this picture. This is the Torres Strait Island flag in the background. So it's against this environment, against these political transformations, that contemporary Aboriginal art develops. And to just give an idea of where we are at this time in terms of Aboriginal art, I'm putting up just 2 pictures of, by 2020, we have a National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Award ceremony. It's sponsored by Telstra, the Australian phone company. And the artists who are now quite aware of, and to some extent negotiating within the Western system, are given awards for their painting. What I find interesting is that this is the winner of the main award, and he is, again, a tribal Aborigine. He lives out still in his traditional land. The title of this is Yalpari Hinu. Yeah, the pronunciations I apologize for. It's very hard still to learn to say the names correctly. What I want to stress here is that we'll see very different styles by this time, but they all, for the most part, are referring to the people's land, to their place. Place and a conception of their land is their identity. So in this case, it's really defined by now by some knowledge of Western art. And another winner is this wonderful group of women who, again, the name of their piece, which is behind them, which they would have painted on the ground, means our place. And Chala, which we'll see on the map in a minute, is utterly remote. It is at the border between South Australia, Northern Territory, and Western Australia. So these are still people who are living essentially a traditional life, but we'll talk a little bit more about what that means at this point. So I just wanted to put these up to show the kinds of things that are being made now and the kind of people who are making them. Now, Aborigines, of course, have been making art that is creating images since ancient times. And I want to just show some of the rock art figures. These are probably some of the oldest rock art images. Here we have from the Kimberley region in Western Australia, images of the Wanginas. The Wanginas are one of the most important creation myths across a broad spectrum of different Aboriginal groups. And to give an idea of, this was the Wangina figure, the motif, this totem appeared at the Sydney Olympics as one of the figures in the ceremony. But to get an idea, to sort of get us into the frame of mind of how we're going to try to discuss Aboriginal thinking and their cosmology, I'm going to read what George, my husband, wrote about the Wangina spirits, the Wangina figures, in our Blue Guide. The regional Aboriginal rock paintings center around Wangina spirits. Involved in the creation myths, these wondrous fertility guardians bring the monsoons and cyclones to ensure regeneration of life. They are in human form with hair that is also the area's large white cumulonimbus clouds. They can cause lightning to emanate from their feathered headdresses. I think you can see it more in that. The Wangina live the dry months of the year in their self-portrait rock paintings. During the wet, the local Aboriginal people preserve them by retouching the paintings while the Wangina are away tending to the rains. So these are spirits that are incorporated into the figures, and they are present. They're not something that happened long ago. These are the fact that they come and make sure that they're painted well and taken care of while they're off tending the clouds. So that will just put us in the frame of mind to try to understand this very aesthetic cosmology. Also in rock art in the Kakadu National Park, in the Kakadu region, are figures that also appear later as motifs in contemporary Aboriginal art. These are two of the figures that are called mimis, mimi spirits. The mimis are tall, thin beings that live in these rocky escarpments. And they originally were human forms. They now are generally harmless, but on occasions can be mischievous. and they take on a totemic kind of malevolence sometimes, mischievous, but also sometimes a little bit naughty later on. So they look skeletal, and they have that implication sometimes in later paintings. Along with rock art, the earlier Aboriginal traditional art was done either on bark painting, and here's one that was collected by Baldwin Spencer, an early anthropologist, archaeologist, who was one of the first to actually document some of the Aboriginal traditions. This, of course, now is a very complex and vexed issue, because much of what he collected was actually sacred and is men's business or women's business, and should not be viewed by others. So this whole question of what can be seen by someone else is very much a part of the issues that we have to deal with Aboriginal art today. The other way in which these images and these motifs were presented were, of course, in ceremonies as body painting or as sand painting. So here is another one. This is from 1939, from another expedition into the Cox Peninsula, which is up north as well. Probably by this time, the Aborigines would have been aware of what they were not, that they shouldn't be showing certain things to white people. So these are probably initiation painting that was allowable to be seen. Their other form would have been, again, ephemeral, as part of a ceremony, created in the sand and then destroyed after or washed away, wiped away after the ceremony. This comes from a series of very kind of offensive postcards from the early 20th century, in which you can see this is all staged, and there's supposed to be an Aborigine escaping there, and they're shooting, and there are lots of these that are now extremely embarrassing. So most of this early stuff, including the bark paintings, were usually done, or almost always done, for religious purposes, for some kind of ceremonial or ritualistic idea. So those motifs that we have been able to see on bark or canvas paintings are secular variations of the motifs that were consciously ephemeral as body or sand painting. Now, one of the most complex and difficult things for us to understand about all of Aboriginal culture is this concept that has the English translation, the English concept of the dreaming. In Aboriginal language, this is the chukurpa, and it's what Bruce Chatwin, in his book, The Songlines, he's the one who really comes up with that term, the songlines. It isn't a term that Aborigines used, although it does describe a particular aspect of their life. I'm going to just read one description by Wally Caruana. Wally Caruana was the curator of Aboriginal art at the National Gallery of Australia for a long time. And I find his description to help about the dreaming. The dreaming is a European term used by Aborigines to describe the spiritual, natural, and moral order of the cosmos. It relates to the period from the genesis of the universe to a time beyond living memory. The terms do not refer to the state of dreams or unreality, but rather to a state of reality beyond the mundane. The dreaming focuses on the activities and epic deeds of the supernatural beings and creator ancestors, such as the rainbow serpents, the lightning men, the Wagalag sisters, and the Wangina, who in both human and non-human form traveled across the unshaped world, creating everything in it and laying down the laws of social and religious behavior. The dreaming provides the ideological framework by which human society retains a harmonious balance with the universe, a charter and a mandate that has been sanctified over time. The important thing to remember is that it's a part of contemporary being. It's not something that happened in the past. The dreaming is, in an Aboriginal cosmology, a continuing thing. It's meant to be a way that their systems can be maintained. And the belief systems, the Aboriginal cosmology is based upon the law, a spiritual order that has to be tended to keep the world in balance. And there are levels of knowledge and the proper ways of living that are revealed in initiation rites for both men and women. The art that we now associate with Aboriginal painting really begins only in the 1970s, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but I'm putting up an example of one of the best known motifs and styles is this dot painting. This is 1973, so one of the very first, in which for the first time Aborigines begin to translate most of their motifs from their ephemeral body painting and sand painting onto canvases. And in many cases, they hide levels of understanding, or they have abstracted some of their individual motifs of their dreamings. So each of these tribes, each of these people have their own story, their own dreaming story. And once we learn some of the totemic elements, these begin to make sense. This is called sun, moon, and morning star. This is meant to be a campground. This is meant to be the people at the camp. These are meant to be clouds. The dots are often a way of covering up something, but they can also represent, later on, they can also represent aspects of the landscape. This is meant to be the moon or the sun. So we can start to read these, but in a way, to them, it's representational. It's meant to represent a particular part of the landscape or a particular part of their dreaming in the sky. There are various styles, of course, that come out of traditional Aboriginal imagery and are transferred and translated onto canvas and onto board in the early days of developing this contemporary art. One of those is the X-ray style. This is mostly up in Arnhem Land. Here's a kangaroo, which you can see it's X-ray style because we see all of the internal organs. We also see what's this cross-hatching, which looks to us like decorative elements, but it often has some kind of almost hieroglyphic meaning for those who have been initiated. And this is called rark. I don't know how to say that exactly, but the cross-hatching is called rark. So this is the X-ray style is mostly in Arnhem Land and in the Northern Territory. So that's one style. we can see another version of this cross-hatching, also from, this is a little much later, also from the Northern Territory. And this figure, which includes all of this cross-hatching as well, which can be read by those who understand to mean more than just that decorative element. But this is also conveying one of the overriding Aboriginal motifs of the rainbow serpent. The rainbow serpent is a creation symbol story that's shared by several tribes and groups, and it appears in many regions. This is a motif that's probably one of the oldest continuing religious elements in the world. We see some rainbow serpents appearing in some rock art, but it's the one that's been taken up now in contemporary Aboriginal painting as a kind of overriding creation myth. The stories are that he's always associated with water, with billabongs, rivers, creeks, and lagoons. He's a protector of the land, its people, and the source of all life. He can also be a destructive force. But the rainbow serpent is such a revered element that it appears now in many, many different configurations. My son has a painting of the rainbow serpent done by a young Aboriginal in prison, and that was his expression of part of his dreaming. The most common version of the rainbow serpent story is that the world was flat, bare, and cold. He slept under the ground with all the animal tribes in her belly, waiting to be born. When it was time, she pushed up, calling the animals to come from their sleep. So we'll see that all of these elements, all of these images are stories. They're not just paintings, they're a narrative that has levels of and layers of understanding for Aborigines. Now, on the basis of understanding this idea of the dreaming and the rainbow serpent as someone who of a spirit that has to be listened to, I want to just start with an extraordinary story of an extraordinary artist, probably one of my most revered paintings in the world, and that is Rover Thomas's depiction of Cyclone Tracy. Cyclone Tracy, for those, was a very important moment in Australian history. On Christmas Eve of 1974, Cyclone Tracy hit the Northern Territory, entirely destroying the city of Darwin. The city was regarded by the Aboriginal people of the Kimberley region, which was a little bit further over in Western Australia. It was considered as the center of Australian culture. And as cyclones, rain, and storms are usually associated with the rainbow serpent, elders who had been concerned and worried and upset in a way about the incursion of all these white people in Darwin, they interpreted the storm, the cyclone, as a warning to Aboriginal people to reinvigorate their cultural practices. And on this basis, this is what Rover Thomas painted. Again, this enormous black space as the cyclone, and these again would be lines of elements of his landscape that would have made sense to his other tribal members. And here it is now in the National Gallery in Canberra. Rover Thomas, again, one of the aspects too that's complex is that Aborigines find that photographs are offensive, and when an Aborigine dies, you're not supposed to speak his name anymore. So for a long time, we couldn't really talk about, or you could say his first name or that painter. So these are all parts of traditional elements that have to be considered when dealing with this. One of my favorite stories, though, about Rover Thomas, who, again, that's a particular style now that we can identify almost immediately with Rover Thomas and his other paintings. He once walked around or he was by that time very old, and he was in a wheelchair. And my colleague, Sasha Grishin, walked around the National Gallery in Canberra with Rover Thomas to show him all these other Western whitefellas art. And he stopped in front of this Mark Rothko, which is in the National Gallery. And he said, "Oh, that white fella paint like me, but he don't know how to use black." And I just think that's a wonderful example of some kind of affinity, because of course Mark Rothko was also talking about spiritual ideas in his art. So to get an idea, though, of how these paintings work, I thought I'd concentrate on some images of one of these stories, and that is of the Wagalag sisters, as exemplary of how these paintings can work. So I've got one here from, this is the Wagalag story done by Jawalarok Davidi from 1960, and then to show how these motifs can continue and be translated in a different way. This is one from, I'm not even going to pronounce his name, the Wagalag Sisters with Child from 2007. Now, here's the story. This is the image of Yulkari painting for the first time this traditional narrative dreaming, this narrative story. This is the first time that we know of that it was painted onto bark with the knowledge of white people, knowing that he was painting this. The story goes, and this is complicated, the two Wagalag sisters, one of whom was pregnant, were fleeing their home and were being followed by Klansmen. I'm going to go back to this one. Eventually, the Wagalag sisters set up camp beside a fertile water hole at Miramina. There's the water hole. There, one of the sisters polluted the water hole, and the pregnant sister gives birth, which causes Wittich, the python, to wake up. Here's the python. They're the Wagalag sisters. And he wakes up angry and incensed. Wittich creates a storm on emerging from the water hole and attempts to wash the two Wagalag sisters into the well with his downpour. This represents then the first monsoon. The two Wagalag sisters dance and sing sacred songs and attempt to diffuse the situation and keep them safe. But when the sisters become too exhausted to continue, the python is able to swallow them up, including in some parts of the story, a child and a dog. I think we have the child here, but I don't know if we have the dog. However, Wittich develops stomach pains and groans skywards above the land, where he attracts the attention of other great snakes who also rise up into the sky. The great snakes talk, and they discover they all have different names, but they wonder why the python is ill. So realizing he's made a mistake, Wittich falls back and vomits up the sisters, who regain their life from the stinging bites of the caterpillars. And here are the caterpillars depicted here. Undeterred, Wittich beats them with clapsticks. These are clapsticks. And eats them again. Later, somehow, they are visited The clansmen are visited in dreams by the sisters, who tell them where they are and what they have created along the way. So that's an example of a narrative creation story, and how it then is representational in many ways once you understand what all these other elements mean. And these are the clansmen down here in that picture. So in the first one that's done, you can see they're just, the Wagalag sisters are just represented by those little shapes there. And these are the feet of them walking. Here's the python again, and the clapsticks. And again, these areas of rark, these areas of cross-hatching would refer to tribal families or tribal elements that they understand once they've been initiated. So this one is wonderful that he's painting the actual one that we have in the gallery now. Here are some later versions in which you see the same elements, the same motifs, painted in a somewhat different way. And later on, these become nearly iconic. One can recognize immediately when one sees this particular formulation with those figures in the middle as being a story of the Wagalags. And again, narrative, but spiritual as well, and a way of explaining nature, a way of explaining their landscape. Now, the other great stylistic development that most of us recognize now as Aboriginal art are the so-called dot paintings of the desert communities. And I want to note here, 1973, John Chakamara and Mick Namarari Chapalchar. These are some of the very first paintings done in a dot painting style. They develop, as you can tell, out of some of those traditional sand paintings or sand motifs, and they represent in a hieroglyphic way. This is meant to be a campground, water, and they represent the particular place in the landscape from which these people come. Now, where am I? Let's see if that's one. So we can see that from this time, various versions or various stylistic developments grow out of this initial idea of the dot paintings or the motifs, which are then applied to each individual Aboriginal painter's own dreaming. And this is just a detail from a much later painting, 2013, by which time there's a very conscious awareness by the Aboriginal painters and their interaction with the Western art market. But that wasn't the case to begin with. And we can trace the beginnings of this style and of what we call contemporary Aboriginal painting to a single moment and a single place, and that is in Papunya in the early 1970s. Of course, there had been some recognition of Aboriginal art forms placed on canvas or board from a little bit earlier. This is probably some of the earliest done in 1947. The anthropologist Ronald and Catherine Berndt just were doing research among the Yirrkala people, and they handed them some butcher paper and crayons and asked them if they could draw some of their storylines, some of their narratives. And I was able to see an exhibition of these in Queensland a few years ago. So this is one of the first examples. But at this time, remember, there's still, Aboriginal images are still being displayed only in ethnographic contexts, in anthropological museums or as ethnography. They were not yet at all considered to have anything to do with high art, with fine art in a Western text. It wasn't until bark painting was sold by the 1960s in some galleries, but a lot of that had come out of the mission stations, the missionaries in the desert communities looking for ways to raise money. They had already introduced some watercolors. That wasn't really working. But it wasn't until 1959 that a curator at the Art Gallery of New South Wales actually commissioned artists or creators from the Tiwi Islands. The Tiwi live on 2 islands off of the Darwin, off of that coast. And he presented them, he commissioned them to make these poles. These are funerary poles. And he commissioned them to make them to present then and display in an art gallery. And this was the first time that they were removed from an ethnographic setting and displayed as actually having some kind of aesthetic power that would be understandable or appreciated by a Western audience. So this really heralded a shift in tradition, coming out, of course, of an understanding of what European artists had done with primitive art, Picasso and Matisse and others with African masks. So there was this conscious idea of creating these images for a market. But now we're going to come to the 1970s and the beginnings of what we call a modern Aboriginal art. And as I said, this takes place in Papunya. You can see where this is. This is very remote. There's Papunya. There's Hermannsburg is the major Lutheran mission for Aborigines. Here's Alice Springs, the main city in that area. In the 1970s, well, as early as the 1950s, the government, the Australian government, had required the most remote tribes to come in from the Gibson Desert and to settle in this settlement for them in Papunya. In other words, they brought these people off of their land, off of their place, and put them into a place together with different tribes as a way of removing them from their traditional life. It was a very vexed and sad situation for most of these people. In 1972, a young artist and teacher named Jeffrey Barden came to the community, the Papunya community, and he brought with him acrylic paints, and he asked the elders of these tribes if he could have permission to paint the honey ant dreaming onto the side of the school at Papunya. This was the first time they'd been presented with the possibility of painting with acrylic paints, having the materials, and the senior men having to come together and discuss if this is possible, if this is feasible, to depict sacred knowledge in a secular setting. So after much debate, they agreed that it could be done. And this is a picture of the honey ant dreaming. And they were then motivated and empowered to begin painting. This is the men's painting room at Papunya in 1972, using these modern materials, using acrylic paint, board, and eventually canvas. Initially, there was a respect for these ceremonial properties and the proprieties. And so there were, at first, they were doing rather naturalistic depictions. And then they realized that other Aboriginal groups would be seeing these. And this was secret information, secret stuff. And so they began figuring out a way to present their traditional style or their traditional motifs in a way that was not offensive to those who were already initiated. And this is the reason that they begin to abstract or cover up, layer these meanings. These are two of the paintings of the water dreaming by Johnny Warankula Chupurula, which can be considered as the first of the so-called dot paintings. His dots were, for the most part, these little dashes of paint, but also these are, again, images of his land, and the little black dots in this case actually refer to a particular bush berry that resembles a raisin. So it's both representational and also abstracted. And there's probably layers underneath this painting. So this was really the motivation and the beginning of this particular style of art. And again, this is always his particular dreaming and will have particular meaning to him. But now Western people come to see this art, come to appreciate it on a completely different level. And this starts to raise some questions more about how are we going to, this was not made in the beginning as something to sell or something to present in an art gallery. It was meant to just give these men, particularly at this point, women came later, a way of presenting their own dreaming and their own stories to their own people. A similar series of events, but with a little more awareness of the idea of selling art to the white community, brought the art of the Walpiri artists of Northern Territory to the public arena. And again, it came about when a teacher at the school in Yuendumu, there's Yuendumu, there's Alice Springs, Papunya is right down here as well. So again, out in the desert, he asked the senior men of the community to paint the doors of the community school. This is about 1983. They were quite aware of the issues at hand. There had been already a market for some of the Yuendumu women's decorative sticks, in which they are also presenting some of their tribal elements on these sticks. So they were aware of a tourist kind of audience, and they were aware of the issues at hand. It was through these artists who paint the doors. I've got these out of order. Here are two of the doors done at Yuendumu by different artists of different dreamings. And these are 9 of those original doors now installed at the South Australian Museum. They became quite conscious of trying to become a cooperative and a community center to promote their art. This is one of the first Aboriginal-run organizations to benefit the commercial sale of traditional artworks. And I love this picture of, he's one of the major elders of Aboriginal art. And this is the Warlu Kulangu artists organization. And I love this. This is how they would paint on the ground with the dog on the canvas as well. Or sometimes it's a board, but I think this is canvas at this point. So the Yuendumu artists become some of the best known. This is the Star Dreaming done in the 1980s by 3 of the elders of the Walpiri people. This is on the cover of most of the books about Aboriginal art. And again, this is his dreaming of the creation of the constellations. It was also these artists who were commissioned in 1989 to create the Yam Dreaming painting at a groundbreaking landmark exhibition in Paris called the Magicien de la Terre, which is one of the first to exhibit indigenous art from all over the world in this Western context, in a Western museum. And as you can see at the exhibition, the people there give you some context of how enormous this was. And it was a very significant point in the recognition of Aboriginal art abroad and in this high art context rather than as ethnography. In Australia, then, there was a conscious recognition that this was marketable art, that this was something that should be presented. And I just have 2 images here of when I was at a gallery in Sydney in 2010, presented now. These are traditional tribal artists presented in a gallery setting with the white walls, and then the owner will bring out these other pieces to put on the floor. So this creates already this interaction between what is essentially tribal elements, or this art presented from people out in the outback, in the city urban Western tradition. And this brings us then to the very vexed but interesting and the epitome of this interaction in the figure of Emily Kunwarai. And again, we call her now only Emily most of the time. And when she died, we didn't use her name for I think at least a year, but now we just refer to her as Emily. Emily was born in about 1910. She did not take up painting seriously until she was nearly 80. She lived in the Anmatiere language group in the Utopia community. The Utopia community, it's about 250 kilometers northeast of Alice Springs. It's one of the only Aboriginal communities that has successfully resisted control by outside government or religious organizations, and it maintains its traditional way of life. Hence, in a lot of ways, as studies have shown, they're far healthier than similar Aboriginal groups. They still eat traditional foods. Her initial artistic training, again, presented by a teacher who came into the community, bringing acrylic paints, but also starting the women to make batiks. And she worked in batiks for a while, and then she all of a sudden decided she wanted to work on canvas. She sits down and has a great sheet of canvas or sometimes board and began painting. Here is this enormous painting called Earth's Creation, 1994. And so she's sitting there all on her own. Remember, this is her dreaming. These are not just abstractions. And she became immediately a phenomenon. She starts to then developing her own dot style painting. These are her emu dreamings from the late 1980s. And again, these are meant to represent, she says, particular plants and particular parts of her landscape. These are meant to be some kind of bush plant as well. And these were just gobbled up by dealers. And in 2007, that huge painting, this one, Earth's Creation, was purchased by a Sydney auction for $1 million. And so began the frenzy of dealers and get-rich-quick exploiters of her art and others. This caused not only problems it created great problems in the community. Remember, there's not a conscious idea of the individual genius artist. The community is supposed to benefit from whatever happens. They're not a society that's based upon money. So there was much pressure on both sides, a resentment of her success on one side, and then the white dealers coming in and saying how she should paint, because certain paintings, certain directions were more popular with the buyers. So she begins to paint in different styles, and later on, because of this push, there was a kind of diminution in some of her. She was just frantically painting all the time. She once described to a friend that she had to escape from 5 or 6 carloads of wannabe art dealers at Utopia. And the dealer at Sotheby's, who tried to protect this kind of commercialization, said she's an example of an Aboriginal artist who was relentlessly pursued by carpetbaggers toward the ends of her career. She has become still immensely successful, and it is the paintings of Emily which really started the battle about Aboriginal, is it ethnography? Are we being sacrilegious by presenting her art to a Western audience? I was at an important conference in which an art historian got up to talk about the creation work and her other large paintings within art historical terms of composition, of color, of three-dimensionality, and all of those kinds of things. The things that she was comparing, for example, some of her elements and some of her ways of painting to Cézanne. The ethnographers in the audience stood up and protested that this was a degradation of her art because it wasn't what she had in mind. And this began a real kind of argument about what do we do with our aesthetic appreciation of this art. I could stand in front of an Emily painting forever. I find them just so evocative and so powerful. It has nothing to do with my understanding of her narrative story. This is an exhibition in Japan of Emily's works. Margot Neal was the curator. She was one of my students back at ANU, the most confident person I've ever met. This was a huge blockbuster show, and again, Emily becomes embodied and becomes incorporated into the Western art world. Finally, I want to look at just a few of the other issues that come up about Aboriginal artists. What do we do about those who have been trained now in Western art, of which there are now many? This is one of my favorite artists of the time. This is Lynn Onus, whose father was Aboriginal, his mother was Scottish. But he is initiated into his tribe. And he has created these works, which are really now iconic pieces. This is the fruit bats, which are hanging off of, in Aboriginal colors, and they're little dots of poop down here that are dotted, and they're hanging off of a Hills hoist. The Hills hoist is the iconic Australian clothesline. So that's the motif of suburbia, along with these Aboriginal fruit bats. And this one below is his dingoes, one of his earliest works, again in the colors of the Aboriginal flag. And this is another interesting example. I once took my son's school group through the gallery, and they stopped at this painting, or this sculptural piece. And this dog that's going through the fence is a little bit lighter in color. And so the kids immediately said, oh, he's a ghost. He's just a ghost that's walking through this. And of course, this is a comment on Aboriginals in custody, deaths in custody, the rabbit-proof fence, all of those questions of detention. But I was once at a talk by Lynn Onis, and I told him that. I told him that the kids thought this was a ghost because it was lighter than the other ones. And he said, oh no, I just ran out of color. So I don't know whether to take that seriously or not. And finally, one of the issues that George and I always have big arguments about, this is Ginger Riley Munduwalala, who won one of the Aboriginal Art Awards in the 1990s. And George, particularly as a trained folklorist, objects to this as being Aboriginal art. He says it's done by an Aborigine, but it is more like folk art, since it's not done in these particular styles. And that's one that others will object to that interpretation, but it's one of the parts that comes up, one of the questions that comes up. The other question that comes up, and here's one of the dot paintings that we saw early on, and this has now been incorporated into the Australian passport. And this is a question of using these motifs in a decorative way. And there are, of course, now many Aboriginal artists who are doing this. So there are questions again. Have we reached a point at which all of those questions of secret knowledge are left out or not? And finally, I wanted to just end with this picture of probably the most famous Aboriginal design, and that is the Aboriginal flag, which now flies everywhere in Australia. It became an official Australian flag in 1995, and you'll see it along with the Torres Strait Island flag and the Australian flag flying over every public business, a public building in Australia. And this was designed by Harold Thomas, who is an urban Aborigine, of course. So that's it. So thanks, everyone. If you'd like to ask any questions, turn on your sound.
I'm waiting for you to call on me.
Okay. Hi, Gay.
Hi. I was, when you refer to the dot paintings, let's say the early ones where they were really the dreaming paintings, did they paint something as, I don't know what their objective was. And then once they achieved their objective, then they covered it up with the dots, because you said they're covering stuff up. So I was wondering, is there a step where it's a painting of their dreaming, and then once they're happy with that, then they cover it up with dots?
It was more that at the beginning they kind of did representational elements, and then they went, no, we can't do that. So they kind of covered it up. But then I think those abstract elements become the motifs themselves. And so they only paint those elements themselves. I think those early paintings, they did actually start with sort of representational parts, and then they cover it up. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. Yag needs it.
Question about,
Hi.
hi, I have a question about the dots too. Are the dots part of their own artistic repertoire, like on the rock paintings? Do you see dots as well?
Well, more the in the sand, there are dots, but not as, I know what you're saying. Yeah, not as much.
Where they got the dots from.
That is part of the. Let's see what there was one part here that I was just reading again, and it says that the artist decided to eliminate sacred elements and abstracted the design into dots to conceal their sacred designs, which they used in ceremony. So I think the dots do become hieroglyphic, or almost like a Morse code or something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, as a Japanese art historian, I can't help making a connection to Yayoi Kusama's work and all her dots that were her way of obliterating
okay.
a lot of things, including her own feelings, her own pain, but there were a lot of dots, you know, there's her dots. So I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. I also had someone at another talk tell me that there's a group in India, an indigenous group, that paints in similar ways. And I think in terms of those motifs, those abstracted motifs, you can almost, you know, there are Western art historians like Regal, who talks about ornamentation and how that seems to be part of an indigenous, almost psychic urge or something. You know, there are comparisons, and there are ways that we can see, and the Aborigines that I knew in Canberra, many of them are involved in indigenous organizations, which are talking with groups in Canada and Africa and all over the place. So there is that consciousness, but that's an interesting point. I hadn't really thought about whether it is a matter of using the dots as a way to cover up something. Yeah.
It's so ironic, because that's what we think of as one of the main characteristics of their art, but it's not really, it wasn't really that to them. It's something that they used it as a tool to hide the sacred nature instead of, you know, a motif. So it's really interesting.
Yeah. The thing I find so fascinating, the story of Barden and these poor groups that were just brought into a place, because they are completely attached to land. The land is their identity. The minute they leave their land, it's somewhere else. It's not there. You know, it's not theirs. And so to take them off of the tribal land and to place them together with these other groups in a completely, to them, foreign environment was just death, practically, you know. So when he presents this possibility of expressing their stories, it changes everything. Yeah, it gives them back some agency, and that seems to be what's important. So, hi, all you people.
I have another question.
Hello.
Yeah.
What's a good book to start reading more about this?
Wally Caruana's Aboriginal Art. Let me see if I have it. That's the best one. What did I do with it? I can't find it. Oh, there it is. Here it is. This is the best one. Can you see it? Yeah. That's a good one. The other one, Peter Sutton is the first one to really kind of discuss the dreaming in a way that makes sense.
Peter
And
Sutton?
yeah.
Okay, because that was the thing that's so interesting to me is are these, so it's like a personal ethos. Each
Yes.
artist has their own of course we all have our own sense of what our creation story is.
Yes.
They are able to put that down.
What's so difficult for me and for Westerners to comprehend is that this is now. It's their being. It's not a story that was back then, okay? And it's all about this about the law and this balance of the, it's a very ascetic cosmology.
So a person's story now would be quite different from a painting they did 10 years before.
That's a good question. I don't know. I think the thing that I found, that was why I find Rover Thomas's paintings so exciting, because he had never done anything like that. He'd never painted before. And it was that moment that he said, we're losing our ways, we're losing our traditions. The rainbow serpent has spoken, or whatever. And I have to express that, So it's really, and I always say that I see no hope for reconciliation of the Western and Aboriginal way. And I always say, if they've been there for 60,000 years, if they're just patient and keep the old ways, maybe they'll get it back again. But yeah, it's very interesting to watch the tribal people come into urban settings. They would always bring them down to Canberra for native title stuff. They always brought them down in July, which is winter. And so you'd have these people from Arnhem Land coming down when it's very cold in Canberra. And it was like they'd arrived in Mars or something. It was just a completely different place. So another great one, my friend Wynn told me about that film, the Wim Herzog. So if you can see that, Helmut Herzog. Is he? No, what's his first name? Anyway, Herzog's thing, Nomad, which talks a lot about Bruce Chatwin and songlines, is very interesting, because you'll see contemporary Aborigines trying to negotiate how they can deal with his idea of songlines, okay? And so they're very, they're not dismissive of it, but they're just are trying to incorporate it into a way that makes sense to them. And they also talk very articulately about why the early anthropologists' works and the images that they present are taboo now, and why they shouldn't be seen. So that's an interesting one to see, if you can. Anything else?
Yes.
Erica.
Yes. Oh, hi, Yash.
Hi. I just want to say thank you so much.
Thank you.
I've learned an awful lot. It made me think of all the art in India, and I'm sure you know about that.
Uh-huh.
But your talk has given me a wonderful insight into reviewing all that again and reappreciating it. I wish there were more people like you. I wish, you could travel with me through India and do that, because, your knowledge, and it's overriding every style, because all original art, Red Indian art, Aboriginal art, Egyptian, all I mean, the Ajanta Ellora caves, you must have heard of those.
Yes, yes.
All of the paintings in there are so interesting. But because I listened to you, I can appreciate that much more again today.
Oh, good.
When I see it. Well, it's because, you know, knowledge is so important.
Yeah.
You know, I was the type when I was much younger, I just poo-pooed art. I thought, oh, you know.
Yeah.
But I never bothered to appreciate it.
Yeah.
But now,
looking is harder than it looks.
oh, you were wonderful. I love.
Thank you. When I initially wrote this was in connection with the first major Aboriginal art show in London. That was in 2017. So
the most interesting thing was I have been to many of these places that in Australia.
Oh, you were?
Yeah, but
okay.
I knew nothing.
Yeah.
You know, because we went with Exxon, and I was terribly young. I mean, early 30s.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, I mean, art was something for later on in life, you know. Now I was going to have a good time. But I wish I could go back there with you again. It would have been wonderful.
Thanks.
Anyway,
I wish I could go back too.
Thank
Mayor,
you.
did you have?
Yeah, I just, first of all, I didn't say before, but thank you. This has been great. It's such a treat. It's just been lovely.
Well, thanks for your
talk and explain
too.
all.
Yeah.
I'm glad we can share this with each other.
Yeah.
I had a question about the dreamings, and there's the honey ant dreaming, the emu dreaming. Are those depictions of the kind of way of being of those creatures? Is that what it means when the dreamings are associated with specific creatures? I can't get my head around.
The creatures are the spiritual aspect of their story. Okay. And they're not exactly creatures. They're
the link.
Yeah.
The link between.
Yeah.
The manifestation.
Yeah, the manifestation of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
It's really there. I only have a tenuous understanding of it. And as I said, I just think it's so difficult for Westerners to even get into that. And it's not even the same as like Native American and you know, the idea of the great spirits, or, you know, it's different. And I think it's from being so ascetic and living such a nomadic, non-material culture. You know, they just wandered and lived in these small or these huge places. The interesting thing to me is that flying over Australia, if you fly over the middle, it looks like those paintings.
Yeah.
It looks like a dot painting, or you know, you see those lines and different colors, and it really blew me away when I saw that the first time.
Can I ask one last question, and then I'll mute myself permanently?
Okay.
I was wondering if there are any art historians and gallerists and curators who are part of the Aboriginal communities who are interpreting and
now there are.
Their art now? Okay, that's good.
The woman who is the curator, Daphne, what's Daphne's last name? She's the curator at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and she's an initiated tribal member. But the urban Aborigines is a whole nother issue. You know, that's a whole nother vexed problem. Lots of homelessness and, you know, drug problems and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And some of the outer communities, again, because of this displacement, have real problems, you know. But to me, because I'm coming from this as an art historian, the fascinating thing is this interaction between a Western art market and this very vivid and exciting art that can so easily be commercialized or ruined that way. So, is there anybody else? Yes, hi.
Hi, Erica. I just wanted to thank you so much.
Thank you.
When I heard you speak at Art Center about craftsman style of architecture and coming from Australia, I told you then I could take any class from you.
Oh, thank you.
I love the knowledge and what you give to us, and I wish you had more of these classes. I could on any subject. And a dream trip would be to go with Yaj, who's lived all over the world, and you together. You guys should curate a trip.
Right. And now none of us can travel anywhere.
I know. But thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I know nothing about Australia. Nothing. You know. So
well,
thank
now
you.
You do. And you probably know more than a lot of Australians do because
it's lovely.
Well, now that I read The Exiles, right?
Oh, yes. Bring me that book. I want to see that. Yeah. Anyone else? It's great to see you all. Hi, Cindy. I can't hear you. You have to unmute.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Susan ever get her sound on?
I don't know.
Oh,
I can't.
Okay.
I mean, she has had that problem before when we've done Zoom, so I don't know.
Okay.
She has a different system than I do, so.
Okay. And Nancy, are you there?
I am, and there's just so much I want to ask you. We're going to have to continue this conversation.
Okay.
It was wonderful, and I'm
Thank
so
you.
grateful. I learned.
And you see my birds?
I did see your birds, yeah, and I'm completely intrigued by this idea of the dreaming, and just want to really unpack that. Oh, that's wonderful. What is that?
That's my Aboriginal bird.
Oh, it's
This was given to me as a housewarming gift.
Wow.
Yeah.
On the back.
And by John Aldman, who was the head of the Indigenous art group. And he once wanted to hire George, but he could only hire people that had Indigenous blood. So he tried to find out if he had Swami or something. That would have worked, but he didn't. So.
It didn't. Okay. Oh, it's beautiful.
Oh,
though.
well, I'm so glad I got to see you, Nancy. You're
Oh,
in the
I'm
dark.
so glad too. And I'm absolutely intrigued by this whole spirituality and how it's reflected in the art. I'm puzzling over the dreaming, and I'm kind of wondering, you kept talking about how it's now and contrasting that with things that were long ago. But also talking about the importance of maintaining tradition. So I'm guessing this is more of an imminence, that the dreaming is constantly ongoing, but
yes, it's very
also okay.
Yeah,
So I guess that's why I didn't raise my hand, because it just seems like a lot to try to unpack.
It is, and it's Another, the Sutton book is good, and Wally Caruana is good on the art and how the art relates to it. Let me think of who else might be a good one to read. I'll write to you.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. I guess.
Okay.
And so is the nowness kind of an immanence, like their spirituality is everywhere and connected with?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Connected with the land and the creatures.
It is their being. It is their identity. Their identity is the land. If you see that Herzog film in the part about the Aborigines, listen to that old Aborigine they talk to, and they ask him something about leaving on a plane, and he said, "Oh, that's beyond understanding." You know, somebody leaving and flying somewhere else. He just said they don't have anything to do with spirit. That's interesting. It's very, very interesting. And one of the first writers about Australia who was on the first fleet is named Watkin Trench, and he talks about the Aboriginal guides that they had, and before they slaughtered them all or had them they gave them blankets that had smallpox in them, stuff like that. Anyway, they would go up to a certain point in the land, and then they'd say, no, we can't go further. That's elsewhere. That's someone else's. You know, they just will not. They would not understand that this is our dream. This is our part. This is where we belong, and they belong there. So yeah, it's really complex.
So is the dreaming though an individual thing, or is it a community thing?
Everybody has their own, but there are aspects of the dreaming that are central to that particular group, that moiety. And they talk about their skin names, you know, and their relations to this other, you know, other person. So there are parts of it that are related, but each individual has their own understanding of what their individual dreaming is. Yeah.
Well, it's just fascinating.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm going to have to private message you with questions and comments because I have a lot.
Okay. Go ahead.
Erica, I think you're going to be getting a lot of correspondence.
Can I ask
Okay.
you some more? Or does everybody have to go? I think everybody maybe has to go, but I wanted to ask one more question.
Bye. Bye.
Bye,
Bye.
Erica.
Bye. Are you going to, Mayor?
Oh, I just wanted to ask one more question with a picture.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Oh dear, you're cutting out. Whoop, you're cutting out. I can't hear you.
This
There. Now can I hear you?
thing, I actually, can you see it?
Oh, there. Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, well, it's
Yeah. Yes, that's a nice
Can you see
one.
the painting?
Uh-huh. Where'd you get
So
that?
I found it at the Goodwill.
Oh,
I was-
you're kidding.
I was looking for a frame because I look for frames there, and I found this, and I just thought, ooh, that looks like something rather special. And so
Yeah,
I
that's
grabbed it.
great.
And it's
That's kind of a more commercialized one.
absolutely
Yeah, where
yeah.
they've taken the motifs and we don't know whether that's actually a dreaming or whether they
Right.
just picked up on the
I can
styles.
see some of the motifs you were explaining in there, though.
Mhm.
So that thanks
Mhm.
for help with that. But so
Yeah.
that got me sort of digging around, looking, and so thank you for everything today because then now I understand it better. So thank
Okay.
you. Nice to see you, Nancy.
Yeah, and David's there too, I think, somewhere.
Yeah,
Okay.
under health sciences, the health sciences library. I think that might be.
Oh, good. I did record it. Yay.
Well, thank you so much. What a treat.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erica.
Bye.
You're welcome. Any more questions?
Lots.
Okay.
We'll do it later.
See you all later. I'll turn this
Bye-bye.
off.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Do you want to stop cloud recording? Yes.